Welcome to the adventures of self. Conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people as they explore what it means to be self-expressed. Come on in. Join the adventure. So, welcome, Dan McCrory, to the Adventures of Self.
Thank you, Taylor.
There's a lot that I want to talk about with you, but I think in particular what strikes me, because we just spent a minute or so connecting before to start this recording, and the things that came through were like the sense of sincerity of the conversation, of getting to know somebody, right? I mean, we've never met in real life. We've had a brief conversation, and yet I think there is something that we can feel that connects us, and the intention of having a sincere connection and really connecting with the human that's across the screen, I think is really important.
Definitely. And the more you know about the other person, the more you find things in common.
Yeah, it's so true. Like we tend to sort of look at people or imagine other people, see people, and I know. I mean, I grew up as an only child, so I tend to think of myself as different from everybody. And as I've gotten older, I can still recognize the differences and the distinctions, but often I find myself really moving towards, as you say, the things that connect us, the things that we do find sort of quite magically sometimes that we have in common.
Exactly.
So specifically, you came on because you've recently written a book that's been published called Capitalism Killed the Middle Class. So this is in the US, although I think it's probably around the world. Is that fair to say?
Everywhere I've gone, they say, "When is the book coming out in Italian or Thai or
Right.
French?" They like you said, the things I complained about in the book, 25 ways the system is rigged against you, are pretty universal.
And so, I mean, it's quite an undertaking to go into something like this. What sort of sparked you? What was the kind of the initial spark for you, or the focus, the impetus?
Well, I was a union president, and I realized that a lot of things that are now in the history books, as far as the Reagan presidential administration and some of the things that happened under him, and then later um, events that transpired against the working and middle class, I had lived through, and I wanted to impart those to the next generation. So first, I tried running for a political office, and I couldn't. I was running against the status quo. I was running against congressional staffers who everybody wanted to please their bosses, and so they were the ones that got elected, and so the status quo is perpetuated. So I realized that wasn't the route to take. So I started writing this book, and I realized that how much of what I went through is still relevant to people in the next generation. So I started digging and finding other things like the criminal justice system, the difference in healthcare for the haves and the have-nots, and so many ways that we're separated based on our income.
And what was the sort of the experience from the because you said you were a union president, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And for what industry?
Telecommunications industry. We represented
Okay.
about 1,500 people in my particular local.
Okay. And what, I mean, because in many ways, I mean, unions have sort of, a lot of them have disappeared. And what's been, I mean, what's been your experience with that? What would you say the primary reason for that is?
I think one reason was we were victims of our own success. We were able to get a lot of things accomplished through the legislative route. And so a lot of things, for instance, in the beginning, there was the issue of child labor,
Mm,
and we got that taken care of. And all these things that have come up, healthcare, all those issues have been taken care of, but yet there's still there's this chance because of their political solutions that things can go backwards. So
mhm.
that's why we need to have a resurgence of the labor movement. I think it's ultimately going to be the salvation of the working and middle class. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Go ahead. Keep going.
I wanted to show a way, a dotted line between what had transpired in the past to where we're headed. And the millennials that are coming up now realize that the labor movement is a no-brainer. They realize that the only way they're going to have any stability in their lives, any way they're going to have these things that our generation has taken taken for granted, is by strengthening the labor movement. And we're seeing a major movement in that direction.
Mm.
So,
And and so there is actually movement that I wanted to ask about that because like one of the things we hear about a lot is the sort of the general replacement of people. I mean, there's this projected shift of I don't know how many millions or tens of millions of people over the coming years in sort of throughout all sectors. We kind of this idea of automation was kind of initially thought like, oh, this will make things easier for us. It's like there'll be machines that will clean the toilets or that will serve your fast food, right? And you think, okay, yeah, that's, I mean, it may put people out of work and that has to be dealt with, but you can kind of see that those tasks, quite menial tasks, right, sort of low end entry level work, and we've seen that, right, in like in sort of traditionally more manufacturing, right, the robots that built cars, and I'm sure every type of electronic and machinery. And what I've heard about as well, because I used to work as a lawyer, and in finance, how much of those jobs, right, the accountancy, the sort of the research and analysis of banks and even now in healthcare, right, a lot of the front end question that used to be done by people to actually find out information about where somebody was hurting or what was going on, that has is all kind of scaled or prepared for kind of replacement and automation.
yes, unfortunately, in the beginning of the whole thing with artificial intelligence was they said that, well, computers will never replace certain things because they can only handle simple tasks. But
Mm,
what the computer programmers found was if you take a real big job and break it down into little pieces, the artificial intelligence can handle it just fine. And they're
mhm.
finding that even writers are worried now because their writing can be replaced by AI, and that's why I brought it up in the book. And I recognize that the things that they're doing with universal basic income can solve part of that problem, because if you have a steady income coming in, you can go out there and find your job that's not being replaced by artificial intelligence. So
Mm.
technology is going to change the whole conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and I was actually just thinking about asking about universal basic income because it kind of, there's a bit of a double-edged sword to it, and so I'd like to hear, what your experience with it is. I mean, the idea is that there is this massive. I mean, I think the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is this massive shift happening. Like we're kind of in the tidal wave of that, so it's kind of hard to steer that off quite quickly. And so jobs are being replaced. Automation is happening, right? AI is doing this, and there are tens of millions or maybe hundreds of millions, I don't know, around the world who are at risk of having their skills, their livelihood replaced and made redundant. And so those you can retrain and reskill a certain percentage of population, but retraining takes time. Really, it can be quite inefficient, particularly if you're talking about hundreds of millions or tens of millions of people. And so one of the solutions been talked about is, this idea that well, everybody will have a basic income that will meet, I think, their kind of basic needs, the, housing, food, and I don't know, maybe some sort of, cost of living for basic leisure activity. And so I guess first of all is a question, where does that come from? And people are talking like taxing corporations or whomever. And then the other question is, does that actually satisfy people? Most of us, certainly in the US, and I mean, I live here in the UK. I mean, there are people, that obviously aren't capable or, that do get benefits. But most people have it in their sort of consciousness that they work for a living, they work for a wage. And so can we easily transition everybody to saying, well, here's just a basic income, and then you can go kind of do what you want, you can be creative and all these other things. So I'd be interested to hear your take on these things.
Well, when I was doing my research for the book, one of the first places that was trying it was Finland, and they had a test group of people that were giving a certain stipend every month, and they could spend it any way they wanted to, and they studied those people, and it turns out that they did okay, but this Finnish union, a very conservative union, said it makes people have to rely on the government once again for any kind of basic income, and so they were against it. But it's been tried here in California, in a city called Stockton, and they had a lady on the radio the other day who said that she was very close to living in her car. She was going to lose her apartment, and then she was selected as one of these test subjects. And she was able to create a nest egg and to actually dig her way out of debt, and was now on the positive side of things. And they released the results just the other day about how it's affected all of the folks in Stockton who are involved in it. And it turns out that it's a very good thing, and it can actually help people. So I'm solidly behind it myself, and I will hope that it spreads. It is a way to deal with that whole issue of technology and runaway technology, unfettered capitalism, all the jobs that we've lost through manufacturing to other countries. You're not going to get those jobs back, and you need some kind of training, and all those things need to go together. So I have big hopes.
Yeah, I mean, we're in this kind of massive shift, right? I mean, some people would say like, well, technology is just a resource; it can be either used for good or bad, and so I suppose it has that potential. But certainly, the magnitude of what's happening is quite significant. And just to pick up back up on your point, because what you're saying is capitalism killed the middle class, and I mean, I don't know what it is now, but I mean, I kind of remember when I was growing up, you kind of had the, I don't know, 20 to 30% of kind of lower class or lower middle class, I don't know, and then there was this kind of like bulk kind of 60% of like what we call the middle class, which could range from lower middle class to upper middle class, whatever those criteria are. And then you had this kind of upper class, and we hear now about like the extent of the power of, say, the 1% or even the 0.1%, right, which owns, I don't know, something like half the wealth in America. Some really quite dramatic weighting of ownership. And so, I mean, like when you're looking at the history of this, I mean, where does the middle class come from? What is it? And what's the kind of the sanctity of it? Like there's a lot that kind of goes in, because we sort of say like, oh yeah, the middle class, we need to protect that, but kind of like, what is it? Where does this come from?
And I realized that we haven't really spelled it out very well. So
Mm,
that's the first subject I tackled in my book. Right in chapter one, I say, what is the middle class? And you're right. Depending on who you talk to, middle class might be as far as up as 250,000 US, and it go as low as poverty wages. And
mm,
that's considered the middle class. But the government tends to put it at more like a 100,000 US at the top, and then somewhere around 40,000 at the bottom as in US dollars. And I don't know what the current currency transfer is, but I'd say the numbers are pretty comparable.
mm.
And I think that the working class is not always the middle class, and the middle class isn't always the working class. But if you tie the two together, the success of one is dependent on the other.
Mhm. Okay. And this grew out of a particular sort of history of the labor market, right?
Yes.
I mean, it grew up in, I guess it grew up in tandem with capitalism, the sort of modern capitalism we have, this kind of leverage capitalism where there's a few people who are providing capital for a workforce below that.
The Industrial Revolution changed things so totally. And then Ford came up with the assembly line process that allowed skilled workers to actually put together a car. And then he paid them enough wages to where they could afford to buy one themselves. And the things just sort of took off from there.
And so where, if capitalism is indeed killing the middle class, kind of where did we go wrong? I mean, is it just with technology recently, or is it kind of, are the seeds back with Henry Ford? I mean, where does this kind of, where do you trace this crisis back to?
Actually, in the book, I trace it back to Ronald Reagan, but you could probably go a little bit further back than that. But
Hmm.
under Ronald Reagan, we had first the air traffic controllers strike. They were striking because they said that it was getting to the point where it was dangerous to fly, and they were trying to let the public know that. And Reagan sent them a letter saying, "Well, if you help me get elected, then I'll help you." And what he did was he helped them out the door. That's where we established the whole um, idea of permanent replacement as opposed to firing people because they were in a union, because that is actually illegal.
Sorry,
So
say, I
permanent,
can you speak to that? I'm not quite sure I understand. Permanent replacement as opposed to firing.
he said that you it's illegal to fire folks, but
Hmm.
you can permanently replace them.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So yeah, it was semantics basically.
Yeah.
And not only did that, he also created this whole so-called experiment with the maquiladoras, which was making companies moving south of the border so that they could make things cheaply. It was, like I said, it was termed an experiment to see
Mm,
if that could work, and that rolled into NAFTA, which, as you know, created a situation where millions of manufacturing and other jobs were lost.
yeah.
And when they moved into Mexico, they could pay cheaper wages. And even though Mexico has environmental laws, they were not enforced like ours are. So,
Yeah.
and of course, if you affect the environment in Mexico, there's only a river there. It's not going to keep the environmental messes over in Mexico. They're going to come across the border,
Mm.
and that's what
And
happened.
yeah, and I mean, there was also, I mean, there's NAFTA, but there's also, excuse me, um, there was, even going back, I think post Second World War, a lot of technology was centered around Asia. And I think the U.S. really helped Japan and Taiwan in the development of those industries. There's obviously natural talent and skills there as well. And it's kind of well known that a lot of the sort of smaller kind of like filler stuff that we get, whether it's like tiny parts that go into something bigger, or like here in the UK they call it tat. I mean, I think we'd call it junk, right? Just like, here's this plastic thing, here's this toy, whatever. Like all that kind of moved to China, right? And it was kind of, it was always like, the, not the joke, but like everything was kind of made in China, right? All this kind of low end stuff. And China now, with its significant power, right, is actually moving into a more high tech space, and getting having a lot of that work done, and sort of shipping their work out into other developing nations in and around the Asian Pacific. So there's kind of this race to keep like moving the low paying jobs into different countries.
Exactly. We call it a race to the bottom
Race to the bottom, yeah.
because there's always a country that'll do it for cheaper.
Right. I mean, at some point, do we run out of countries, or do we?
Probably.
Right.
What I hope is that we find some way to maybe cars will be manufactured in this country, and food will be raised in this country, in this country. There's been all sorts of science fiction stories about that. China is a burgeoning middle class, but it wasn't until 1989, the Tiananmen Square, that they fought to have a piece of the pie. That's what that whole movement was about that time, because the government was taking the money and it wasn't getting down to the people. So they went against the tanks and the soldiers, and thousands were killed. A lot of people don't realize. I think there was something like 11,000 people killed during that time. But the government did budge, and that's where we see when I travel to other countries like Thailand, all of a sudden there's all these Chinese tourists that can afford to come and visit. So there has been an impact, and I think we're going to see more of that.
So in a way, kind of like like there's a vanishing middle class here, or in the US, and probably here in the UK as well, and yet there's a burgeoning sort of growing one in places like China.
Right. Well,
Um,
something had to budge. So I'm glad to see they're raising their lifestyle, and but we need to do something about what's happening in the UK and the US.
yeah, and one of the things that you speak about in the book is the sort of the government system, right? We have like, in the US, it really is a two-party system. Here in the UK, there's two principal parties, but there are a few other smaller parties. In fact, just about, I don't know, whatever it is, 5-7 years ago, there was a coalition government that was run by the Conservatives with the Liberal Democrat Party. But it's kind of and then there's the Scottish National Party, there's Welsh Party, and a few others. But really, I mean, I think you talk about, because in the US it's very, very well known. I mean, there's really two parties. I mean, I think there was that moment when, I mean, this is probably what, 20-30 years ago, that Ross Perot tried to create a third party, and it lasted for, I don't know, a few months or maybe a couple of years, and kind of went the way of the dinosaur, or the DeLorean or something.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing now, thanks to Mr. Trump, is possible third party rising again that he wants to create, and he's going to split the Republican Party. So we're conceivably looking at a Democratic administration for many years to come if he's able to split the Republican Party like that.
Yeah, 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 of course. And I mean, is there possibility that, because there are quite there are a few outlier kind of quite liberal progressive Democrats, and I think certainly starting with Clinton, like the Democrats very much
Mhm.
shifted centrist, right? Um, uh, and and so, do you think there's a possibility of that splitting up as well?
I personally would love to see that because I'm a progressive. I used to be a liberal, like a Clinton liberal, but Clinton did a lot of things. He was successful because he basically stole the Republican agenda.
Hmm.
And so when the other side's talking all your points, what have you? How can you fight against that? Because there are things that you've been espousing for years. So he took their agenda. Look at NAFTA. That's one big way
Hmm.
that he took the Republican agenda and did something with it.
Hmm.
And I don't want to be part of that party. That we call them neoliberals, and they think it's okay to take corporate money, like for the big oil companies and all of that. Where progressives are more ideologues. Progressives say that that's fine, but you can't take money from this group or that group. You need to be true to the stuff that you espouse. And
Hmm.
one of the things that we say is that we're for the little guy.
Yeah.
And how can you say that when all your money comes from big donors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that has come up more and more. I mean, I don't know how much it really is portrayed in the sort of legacy big media, but this idea, or I think it's kind of well understood that both political parties in the U.S. Take significant the vast majority of their money and donations from special interests, right? So corporations and lobbying groups that, I think, as you're saying, don't necessarily look after a broad range, a democratic range of issues, but a very, very select uh, range of issues.
Exactly. In California, we've been trying to open it up for more cities to be able to offer rent control because a lot of people are being priced right out of their homes, and there's this whole gentrification um, thing that's going on in any major city in the state of California, and we've fought against that and tried to open it up for more rent control. And the corporations that own a lot of the available homes that are available for rent are fighting that, and it's been defeated again and again at the ballot box
Mm.
to try to get rent control instituted in other cities.
You bring up California, which is where you're based, and whenever I talk about politics with people, and I've lived here in the UK for a number of years, 15 years, I think, and because most people are used to things at a country level, right? The people used to parliaments, and there may be local elections, but everything is pretty much handled from a legislative basis at the sort of countrywide federal government. Well, not they're not federal, but the country level of parliament. And whenever I talk about politics in America, because people they kind of assume there's this like broad brush, like, well, if the Republican Party gets in, then that means that that's the flavor of the country at that time, or similarly, if the Democrats are in control. And while there is that sort of broad brush for national politics, once you get in, I mean, you've got 50 states, right? So there's 50 other sovereign entities, and then all the county governments and city governments that go along with that. And it gets quite challenging and difficult to talk about what's really happening at a political level. And one of the things, I mean, happy to hear what you have to say about that, but also what the reason I ask about that is because I mean, I grew up on the East Coast of the U.S. And whenever people talk about national presidential elections, it's well known these days that like New York and California will always be blue states. They're gonna vote Democratic, and yet I've always noticed that as liberal as California is in all these ways, it also has this incredibly conservative side to it. Like often you end up with Republican governors, and there was a time, maybe it was because of Reagan, who was from California, but there was a time when California would like it would have very very and this often happens. You'll have Democratic sort of Senate, like state government, and yet the state will vote Republican.
Yeah, it's never made much sense to me.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Is it not you neither? Okay, thought it was
but
just me.
you got a section of the state where all the produce is grown, and they're very conservative. They're very agribusiness, and farmers
Mm,
tend to lean the other way. So you've got this balance and push pull going on constantly. But I hope to actually move the California legislature farther left. And I think because we have both houses and the administration, we can possibly do that. We just have to be bold enough to make those kinds of decisions,
mhm,
such as
mhm.
single payer healthcare. We need that so badly here.
Yeah, I mean, that's I mean something else that I mean, healthcare in the U.S. is a mess,
Yes.
and has been for a long time. And my mother worked in the healthcare industry as a social worker for over 50 years,
Hmm.
and we would have the discussions because I lived here in the UK for 15 years, and there is this assumption that sort of universal healthcare, like people are in lines waiting for weeks and months to get like primary treatment, and there are I mean everything's kind of different in the last year or so, but there are challenges. I mean, but also things are free. I mean, a number of years ago, it was actually when I was out of work. I was between jobs, and I blew out my knee and had to have my ACL replaced.
Hmm.
And that was done on national health care. And because there was a portion of my wages that had gone to that, and to fund the National Health Service. Um, I did actually have to wait several weeks. I mean, it may have even been a couple of months, but in the end, I had excellent service, and got a new knee out of it. And I've talked to people who say, I mean, things like cancer or heart surgery or whatever, like the immediate things, right? The emergency things. It's not like you're going to be sitting waiting for 2 months to have that happen.
Exactly. Yeah, I have a lot of friends in Canada who love their health care system.
Mm,
And that's been one of the complaints that the Republicans have made is that there's these long waiting lines and the so-called death panels that decide that you're not going to get that health care. But that's what's going on with the healthcare insurance industry now. And
hmm
we need to get that middle group out of the picture so that we can actually find out what costs are real and streamline the whole process so that people get the health care they need now.
Sorry, when you say the middle people, who is that referred to?
That's the healthcare industry, the people that have been taught to say no for experimental surgeries,
Mm,
experimental procedures of any kind, basically. And they're actually holding up a lot of innovation and new ways of doing things that would actually help the healthcare system be more effective.
hmm And uh, so, I mean, what's the solution?
The solution is, as I said, get them out of the picture.
Mm,
That's where Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act went wrong. It didn't allow for a negotiation of drug prices. It didn't
mm,
allow for a public option. I mean, there's one in there, but it's so many hoops you have to jump through to create that option, and that's one thing where Joe Biden and I part ways because uh, he was one of the ones that created the Affordable Care Act, and so he wants to hang on to it and despite the fact that it's raised premiums sky high, and a lot of people. I think the Republicans were successful in getting rid of the mandatory coverage, and that's shrunk the pool. So it's costing those that are still in the pool more money than it should.
Yeah, that's one of the things I heard. I mean, I haven't followed it closely, but I did hear that, one of the critiques is it's actually for whatever its original intention was, it's actually ended up raising premiums, which obviously doesn't speak well to, and then things get confused because the idea is that this is providing healthcare for people that wouldn't otherwise have it, and yet it kind of plays into another argument to say, yeah, but by doing this we're raising premiums, it's making it more expensive for everyone, so the whole thing ends up quite sort of muddled and confused.
And that's where we've been for many, many years. And unless he moves off the ACA and considers the things that we're trying to pass, which is universal health care, that's going to stay that way for a long time, because now is the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, it does really feel like on so many different things, and I mean, I know you talk about it in detail in the book. It's like the breadth of things, because we've kind of covered half a dozen or more areas where whether it's jobs, it's politics, it's health, and you talk about education as well. So let's throw that into the mix.
Yes.
What's where did we go wrong on education?
Oh, I could spend half an hour on that at least. I one problem was making Betsy DeVos the head of education at the federal level, because she ended up she's a businesswoman first. She knew nothing about education, and she bought a company that went after people that didn't keep up on their student loan payments, and so I'm glad to see that's been rectified. But I think that there's a lot of, let's see, well, it depends on whether you're talking about fundamentals like K through 12, or if you're talking about higher education. I know in higher education, there are adjunct professors who are living in their cars because they're not making decent wage, and everything because of the pandemic has been thrown wide open here in California. Oh, actually, in the whole country right now, schools are not open, and the teachers I know that I know personally have said they miss that personal connection, and there's still an inequity in what a school in the inner city will get as far as funds as opposed to a school in the suburbs, and we need to even that out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the last year has, I think, thrown so many things off, and so whether that becomes a permanent issue that we have to deal with, I think, kind of remains to be seen. um, my sister works in primary school education and has had to deal with teaching remotely with very young children, which is challenging for everybody, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
and I know that there's a lot in that. There's health considerations for children, for families, for the teachers. So anyway, but yeah, I think there is I mean, one of the things I know about from my own experience, I mean, from when I was in school, and certainly from when you were in school, sorry, not to date you, didn't mean to like say way back when, that but where where America was among the leaders, not necessarily at the top, but among the leaders, whatever, in the top 5, 10, or whatever it is, in so many different areas, that really has fallen off dramatically. In terms of like world tables, right? Whereas America still is one of, if not sort of, I don't know one of the richest by wealth countries per capita, and certainly by magnitude. And yet the education, right there's this talk about, I mean, particularly when you talk about higher education, which may or may not be necessary for many people, but the divide of what's affordable for people, and um, how people are limited in being able to get there. You're saying like the inner school, or sorry, the inner city education is so hampered in so many places that there's no real meaningful um, education actually provided to a lot of people.
And that's where my favorite personal favorite presidential candidate Bernie Sanders was
Mm,
at the forefront with where he talked about so-called free college, which just meant free tuition, and it
mm,
would get open up access to so many to raise and for instance, for me, I was the first one in my family to go to college,
mhm.
and that opportunity allowed me to raise my capabilities enough to where I could actually write a book.
Mm,
And I see that most of the books are written by people who grew up in wealthy families because they had that off time to where they could do things like that, and the training from higher education. I think that uh, that's the way to go. We need to do that. In California, we have something called junior colleges or community colleges,
mhm.
where up until the mid '80s, they were free,
Yeah,
and the tuition was free. And then gradually they kept raising the prices and raising the fees, and
yeah,
to where the point where all other colleges are at is that you can't afford to go.
yeah. And one of the things you raised, or you were talking about Betsy DeVos, and but I think regardless of her position, I think there is a this idea that I mean, it goes back, even a couple of generations. This idea of bringing business into these services.
Mm.
It happened at the Defense Department back in the '60s with what's his name, McNamara, right, who came from Ford Motor Company and was put into the Department of Defense. And there was kind of like, well, how can you do this? This person has no military or defense experience, and he ran it like a company. And some would say that was a very good thing, and some would say, well, that's what's gotten us into a lot of the other messes we have. And so there is this idea that everything becomes a business: education, health, defense, everything becomes a business. And I suppose on the sort of on one side, one could say, well, look, things need to be efficient, right? Because if you don't look at things from a cost perspective, then it'll be terribly inefficient. But then, if everything is just has a dollar or a pound or whatever the currency is price tag on it, then we're like, that's a pretty limiting way of looking at us as a species.
It definitely is. And what they found that these so-called public-private partnerships have actually cost more when they're given these jobs are given to the private sector, including those that have gone to Betsy DeVos's brother Eric Prince, who started Blackwater.
Mhm.
Those people said the way you're going to save money is give this stuff to a private company because they can do it, as you said, more efficiently and supposedly cheaper. But again and again and again, for instance, I just read a report that came out of Arizona. There was this group of Quakers that were looking at the criminal justice system and private prisons. And they said that again and again and again, they found that private prisons were less efficient or
Mm,
more costly, and a bill of goods have been sold to the people of
mm,
Arizona.
mm, mm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of a bait and switch. It's like you can talk about the inefficiencies of something, but once that something like that is replaced, it's hard. There's this almost inherent desire to kind of take more from it.
Exactly. And yeah, basic greed,
Mm,
which is what,
mm.
when you look at my book, that's what I'm trying to say in so many words is that greed has got us where we are.
And okay, so let's talk about greed a bit, because I think it's not a partisan thing. It's
No,
not. It's an inherent sort of aspect of humans, right? When if
that's true.
like you put don't take children to a candy store, or be very careful, right? Because it's like, well, they just want it all, right? That's kind of you
Exactly.
don't have to learn that that attribute. I mean, in some ways, I suppose it goes to our concept, our egoic concept of survival. Like, if I have more, then I'll be safe, right? So let me go ahead and get more. And then there's this, and I mean, so there is a natural acknowledgement that that exists, but it's how do we balance that with all the things that come from that, right? Because greed um as a way of being, I mean, I think it's like more and more recognized that that greed, that kind of capitalism kind of gone amok, is, I don't know if you want to say wholly, but is significantly responsible for a lot of the challenges that we face today. But then greed's an inherent part of being human. So what do we do with that?
That's true. I mean, even poor people, there's a whole TV show around the fact that there's hoarders, and that's because people get
Mm,
something and they want to hold on to it. And
hmm
you're right, that's a very basic human trait. And the way we deal with that is we need to have robust oversight of whether it's a corporation or a wealthy person. We need to look at ways that we can sort of curtail that natural trait and do things for the common good. For instance, back in the 30s and the 40s, when Dale Carnegie was around, and all these captains of industry, they paid very high taxes,
hmm
and they did so willingly because the money went back into the community. It paid for infrastructure and things like that. And the tax rate on corporations now is a joke, and on the wealthy, because they want to hoard more of that money, and suppose they put it in research and development, but it actually goes back into the pockets of the CEOs.
mm
So we need to overcome that by oversight.
I think, yeah, I mean, you mentioned this idea, the common good. And I mean, it feels like in a lot of ways we've kind of forgotten what that is about. I mean, we're like,
Well, now we call it socialism.
right, right. But I mean, like, we're aware, like, people that in their community or in their faith, right? There is this concept of that we have a commonality to us, right? I mean, we were talking um before the show, and as we introduced, right? It's like the commonality between us, right? That we
Mhm.
we have things in common, even if we don't agree on something politically or in any other way, right? This commonality of what it means to be human. And I mean, in the work I do, like, I mean, and a lot of the episodes that we have on this show, the what I'm trying to do is kind of bring that sense back in, and the the multidimensionality of that. So there is a common sense about what it means to be human, but the way that's done, the specifics of that are as varied as there are, um, grains of sand or people on this planet. But it does feel like without that, the it's like the individuality, which is such an amazing thing that we have, right? What makes Dan and Taylor and everybody this individual is so amazing. But without the balance of seeing that in relation to who we are as a species, a planet, it's yeah, it just feels really off kilter.
Yeah, and like I said, socialism, that's the way they've gotten away from it because until recently, every generation would have this knee jerk reaction to the word
Mhm.
socialism. For instance, going back to universal basic income, Richard Nixon back in the early, late 60s, early 70s suggested that. and they said, "Oh no, you don't want to do that because everybody's going to say that you're for welfare for all." And
Mm,
so that was a bad thing for a Republican to be in favor of. So it got put by the wayside. But again, it was so over overreach to satisfy some of those things that need to be taken care of, like as I said, our infrastructure and
mm,
basic things that make our society work. You put the word socialism on there, and all of a sudden people back away and say, "No, we're not for that because it's socialism." And
mm,
that's why the Democrats didn't want to go with Bernie, because he had that tag, that word. But the
mhm.
millennials, the new generations coming up, that's not the big bugaboo as it was for our generations. And I'm glad to see that, because we
Mm.
need something sort of in between, because we've got the unfettered capitalism, and we need to counterbalance that with maybe some form of democratic socialism.
Yeah, I mean, and it was quite amazing how millennials and younger generations took to Bernie. I mean, he was incredibly popular, like much more popular with the younger generation than say our generation, which is quite amazing, you know.
Yes. Yeah,
Uh,
he was like a rock star.
yeah, exactly. Um, I wanted to just talk about, because you actually have some other books, and because you're not all about this, which is an amazing subject, and happy to come back to it. But I do want to just spend a little bit of time kind of like highlighting your humanity, and because it's because sometimes, particularly for listeners, people can feel like, oh, this is only about one thing, right? And this is your latest book, and it's just and when did it come out?
It hasn't come out yet.
Oh, it hasn't come out yet, right? Okay.
No, it's targeted for the later part of this year.
Okay, fine. So people will be able to get that, but you've got a couple of other books, and
Well, this one, were you talking about capitalism? This has
yes.
been out for a little over a year.
Ah, okay, right. Okay, so Capitalism Killed the Middle Class has been out for about a year, but you also had a book of poetry.
No, actually, I was just recognized as one of California's best emerging poets. So I ended
Oh,
up
I
in
see. Okay.
the 2020 anthology.
Amazing. And so
Yeah,
I mean, because that's quite a different way of
it
writing.
is.
What
Yes.
what draws you to poetry? Because some people love poetry, and some people think like, oh gosh, they don't understand it, they can't figure it out. It's
Yeah.
yeah. So
Well, I
what
don't even consider myself a poet. I call myself a poet, somebody who's just kind of faking it to explore that realm. Every type of writing that's come my way, I've probably put my toe in the water and tried at least once or twice to do something, and that was good. That actually was a surprising honor to be included in that anthology. I like poetry because it boils it down to the essence
mm,
of what you're trying to say, and
mm,
words can be so evocative.
hmm.
And if you use I used to have business cards that said one word paints a thousand pictures, which is
Hmm.
sort of a play on the original quote, which was one picture paints a thousand. Or I
Yeah,
forget how it goes.
yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So that's what I try to do with poetry. I'm more of a minimalist when it comes to poetry.
Yeah, really interesting. Um, and I mean, what would be what's your hope for capitalism and middle class? Like, I don't know where we're going. I mean, it sort of feels like, I mean, it's interesting because I think it can easily you can easily kind of go down this road of thinking like, oh, we're all doomed, and and maybe we are. But you just spoke about like this you can see this sort of glimmer in younger generations of and maybe that just speaks to the the waves of difference and progress that we go through something for a particular period of time,
Yeah.
and that gives way to something new and different.
Well, what I'm hoping is to get this book into the hands of millennials,
Mm,
so they can learn from our mistakes in the past and get some hope for the successes that we've managed to accomplish and what they will take from there and build on it. I actually wrote a study guide that goes with the book,
all
and
right.
a high school teacher has asked me to come speak to her class once we're back in the classroom about the book. So I'm hoping that more people will learn about it and take it to heart. So I've got two sequels coming up for this book. One's called Rebuilding Union. So
Okay.
I show how what unions have done wrong, what
Mm,
unions have done right, and how they can change to empower more people. And then the other book is called Capitalism, the Global Edition. A friend of mine at a union in Switzerland told me that, well, this is fine that you wrote this book, but let your readers know it only speaks to what's going on in America. We
mhm.
have different ways of doing things here. So what I've done is I compare and contrast four countries: France, Norway, Thailand, and Morocco, and how they treat their working classes, and what we can learn from the way that they do things compared to the way we do things in this country.
Wow, that sounds really, really amazing. And it sounds like you're you're a busy man. I've got a
Oh
couple
yeah,
other
yeah.
books. Yeah, okay. Um, and I mean, it just sounds because what I'm coming to now is a realization, and maybe you kind of alluded to this, but maybe I'm just a little slow. Is that this is as much sort of a cautionary tale, right? It's like
Oh
this is
yes.
yeah, it's not sort of well, this is everything that went wrong. It's like well, here's just reality, and what do we choose to do with it? So because you were talking about like getting into classrooms, working with millennials, so that they have a context for where we've come from, what has happened, that then allows for new beginnings.
Yes, I've tried to draw a line from what's happened in the past, going back to Reagan, going
Hmm.
back to how the trying to start a labor party in this country, because back in the turn of the 20th century, we were neck and neck with Australia about the way that we were going to deal with things. And Australia decided to create a labor party, the very first in the world, by the way,
All right.
and before England.
Hmm.
And then, but we chose not to. There was an 1894 AFL convention where Samuel Gompers, who was our big leader at the time, said, "No, we don't want a labor party." And I wish I could go back in a time machine and find out why the heck he decided that we didn't need one, because so much would have been taken care of if we'd had that.
Yeah, yeah, interesting, really interesting. And so, what would be? I mean, I think as we look to wrap up, what's your hope for this book, for your other books, and for the future?
I think I've made that pretty clear. The millennials and the next generations have to come
Yeah.
up with the answers, and that's one thing my book says is that I don't have all the answers. Nobody does, and we're looking for brilliant,
Mm.
resourceful people to come along and help us build that future.
Yeah, I really love that. This idea, it's like you're just providing information. You don't have all the answers. It's about making connections, and working together to create a brighter future.
Exactly.
Well, Dan, well, thank you so much for
Thank you,
coming
Taylor.
on the show.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, go on, be adventurous. Click the subscribe button. And join us next week for a new adventure. Until then,